Hi everyone, thank you for coming along to this event in the history lecture series of visiting speakers for the history programs. My name's Toby Harper. Today we're welcoming Alex Lindgren-Gibson, who is an associate professor of modern European history at the University of Mississippi. She specializes in the social and cultural history of modern Britain and the British Empire. Her research, in her words, focuses on how the things that shape everyday life, what you eat, where you live, how you work, and who you love, intersect with big historical questions about class, gender, race, empire, and power. Her book from 2 years ago, Working-Class Raj, Colonialism and the Making of Class in British Empire, does all these things. And I really recommend it to anyone who is curious to read more about class, race, empire. It sort of answers these big historical questions in a concrete way using some really, really interesting examples. And she's also published articles in various journals, including a Journal of Colonialism and Colonial History and Victorian Studies. And it's her most recent article from Victorian Studies that she'll be talking about today in the talk titled Pieced Together: Scrapbooks, Imperial Archives, and the Many Lives of Mermanjan. So thanks, Alex. Welcome to. Oh, and of course, sorry, the key thing I forgot to say that's written down here in handwriting that's too terrible for me to make out is that she is also a distinguished graduate of ASU's MA in Public History program from the late 2007. Thank you for joining us once again, Alex, and welcome back to ASU.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. I'm very excited to be here, see campus again, see Tundi again, and talk about this project. So, like Toby said, this is from a recent article, and it also is the result of one of those little pieces of archival discovery that I found while working on the book and could not get out of my head for years. And so I'm going to start here. I'm going to start with this image. And so what do we see? 12 women sporting shoulder-bearing gowns and low-gathered hair of the 1850s, staring out at the viewer. And then hovering over them is this outsized caricature of an Englishman. He has curly bouffant hair and outstretched arms. And he looks almost as if he plans to scoop them up and run away with them. You flip the page of this notebook and you see the women recurring, now dozens and dozens of them, drawn shoulder to shoulder, confronting the viewer. In the same volume, as these sketches, there's evidence of someone learning to read or to write in English. You can see alphabet, name, dates, and things like this. And these eventually sort of give way to more assured writing, household accounts, laundry lists, and eventually short diary entries. These sketches appeared scattered throughout the diaries, sketchbooks, and scrapbooks of Mermanjan, an Afghan woman who married a British officer of the Bombay Army in the 1850s. And this is an image of her. And so this afternoon, I'm talking about the multiple histories of Mermanjan, the woman who created some and most of these images. She left her family in Afghanistan to marry Thomas Mon, a British officer. She traveled with his regiment and eventually settled in Kolpur in present-day Maharashtra after going basically all over India and parts of the British Isles. She learned to read and write in English and mixed with European society in the region. And she even spent time in England and Ireland. In England, she lived in Kent as the sort of respectable, ordinary Victorian housewife, ran a large household, supervised servants, and paid social calls around the country. She recorded her experiences in a series of scrapbooks, sketches, and diaries. And her papers offer a really rare firsthand account from a 19th century Afghan woman of her marriage, her assimilation into British Indian society, and her emotional state. They also offer examples and evidence of the accretion of other hands. And this is part of what makes her story compelling, not only her own history, but the way in which so many other people have contributed, added to, and affected the narrative over time, ultimately taking up Mermanjan's story as their own. Her story has been retold and embellished many times over. Her first husband, Thomas Mann, wrote up a very sort of florid account of their meeting and marriage in which she appeared out of the midst of the Khyber Pass and they fell in love. And this account of the encounter between Mann and Mermanjan has appealed to the romantic sensibilities of a number of chroniclers. Mermanjan herself inserted Thomas's description of their meeting in her sketchbook after his death, literally rewriting his account of their meeting in her own hand, perhaps to assert her own acceptance of that narrative of their courtship. She also told this version of the story to Beatrice Dimmock, a friend she met in India in the 1890s. Dimmock transcribed Mermanjan's memories of the encounter, this time with even more literary flourishes. And Mermanjan must have trusted Beatrice enough to leave not only her story, but her papers, scrapbooks, in Beatrice's keeping. Beatrice's daughter, Gertrude Line, recalled when she was older her mother's tales of a woman who had been dubbed, quote, the Afghan princess, and dug through the family archives to find Mermanjan's sketches and notes. From these, she produced her own version of the story. So this is version 3-ish of the story, published as Mermanjan's Star of the Evening with a sort of heritage press in the early 1970s. And around that same time, she donated Mermanjan's papers to be archived with the India Office records, now at the British Library, along with the papers of her family as a whole. And so these papers have recently once again been unearthed by a descendant of the Dimmock Line family. Felicia Line has written a multi-part account of Mermanjan's life for the British Library's Untold Lives blog, and also produced a documentary on her life story. And so rather than being untold, Mermanjan's story has been actually told over and over again. And this talk is yet another retelling of it. But what I want to do today, in addition to telling that story, is to think through some of the methods that we can use to peel back the layers of interpretation that obscure Mermanjan's history. I don't want to discard these layers, but I want to talk about what we as historians can do to work with those overlapping narratives and perspectives preserved by Mermanjan and added to by competing voices. And in doing this, I'm taking up some really classic questions. Scholars of empire have been asking of archives for decades, right? So Spivak and the Subaltern Speak, and Laura Stoller, Carolyn Steedman, Antoinette Burton, all of these people thinking about exploring the fraught relationships between the historian and the archive and the people it conceals and contains. And so I'm going to start with Mermanjan's own retelling Mermanjan's story, and then I want to draw on some lesser known and less expected bodies of scholarship to think about this story and how it's been preserved in the archive. And those are the histories of scrapbooking. And so finally, after doing that, I'm going to think about what these papers can tell us about the relationship between family, friendship, power, and the archive, and how all of that sort of gets bundled together in the mess of the aftermath of the British Empire. So, little in Mermanjan's own hand exists to recount her early years. And what I'm going to talk about now is sort of pieced together from her own recollections, the way they were retold to friends over her lifetime, and the account written by Thomas Mann. So obviously we are working with some flawed sources here. And Mermanjan was born in 1833 into a well-connected family, which she said was associated with the court of Dost Muhammad. He had been deposed as the ruler of Afghanistan in a British-backed power grab, but by the 1840s, later 1840s, he had retaken power from his rival and was ruling from Kabul. So Mermanjan would have spent her childhood connected to a powerful court in a country recovering from the violence and political chaos of the First Anglo-Afghan War. And I'll do a little very brief background on that conflict. Basically, it resulted from a British attempt to strengthen their position, secure an ally on the frontier, and their conflict with the Sikh Empire, Afghanistan, and Russia, that sort of classic portion of the British, Russian empires, Indian empires, where everything comes to a head in the 19th, 20th, and 21st centuries. By the end of the 1830s, the British government in India started to think that maybe they could have a ruler in place who was a little more attractive to their own kinds of interests. And so they asked Dost Muhammad, occupy the city, install a new ruler as emir, And Kabul remains under British occupation until the end of 1841, when there were a series of uprisings which made it clear that the British could no longer maintain their position. The insurrections were led by Akbar Khan, who was the son of Dost Muhammad, who again, we will revisit in a sec. Khan had made a deal with the British to secure their safe passage out of the city if they would agree to an ordered retreat. But he went back on that agreement, and instead there was sort of a massive uprising against the retreating British. They ended up fleeing out of the city through the mountains, and it became this emblematic moment in British imperial history of that part of the world. And this is kind of like the most iconic image of it, which was created in the next Anglo-Afghan War as a way of talking about sort of the troubles and long-term trauma of that moment. And so this is allegedly the only person to have survived this massacre. He actually wasn't. But this becomes sort of a piece of essentially propaganda art in the late Victorian period that depicts what British people think of when they think of Afghanistan. And the reason that I'm going into this background is that this really helps to kind of shape the position that Mermanjan finds herself in the context of British Indian society. So she's from Afghanistan, which means that she's not Indian. It means that she's not considered to be part of the same sort of social groupings as Indian women would be. But she's also from this place that's considered to be potentially very destructive to the British. And so it's not hard to imagine that being connected to a ruler who had been exiled multiple times would make for an unsettled childhood. And that being connected to a region that had also been marked by so much violence would make for sort of an unsettled sense of your place in the context of British India. So these ideas do not get mentioned at all in Mermanjan's writing, but they're there in the background of her own life, shaping her childhood, shaping her marriages, and her own ability and inclination to assimilate into British Indian society. Okay, zooming that into the specific, Mermanjan's mother died when she was 13, and she really sort of used this as an explanation for the way her life and her future relationships unfolded. She claimed that this meant she had less supervision than other girls of her age would have had. And this explains why she was apparently out riding one day with some attendants when she saw a group of British soldiers pass by and noticed Thomas Mann. And according to the account, he noticed her as well. And in his own written account of the meeting, which she then retranscribed, he recalled that she had quite as sweet a face and figure as I ever thought I had seen. She was mounted on a spirited black horse, which she managed with ease. And so this is kind of like a classic, this is like a gorgeous lady arising from the mist kind of an image. The next day, Mermanjan rode along the same path and again met Mon, though this time reportedly she was riding alone. And again, this is not at all appropriate behavior, whether you have a mother or not. And at this time, Thomas Mann was 44, she was 15. So this is not a relationship that we would have any time for today. And we'll talk about that. So the pair, according to these accounts, met in secret many times, and Thomas eventually asked Mermanjan to marry him. So would this have been unusual or even scandalous in the 1840s? Sort of. I'm going to talk about the difference in age first, and then we're going to talk about the racial dimension. So the really large age discrepancy between the couple obviously is troubling in a modern context. And I've spent a lot of time thinking about this. This is what I've come up with. So in the context of the mid-19th century, this kind of difference in age wouldn't have been unheard of, right? But it usually happened when there was some sort of strategic advantage to making that kind of marriage. And this was decidedly not an advantageous marriage for either party. Again, thinking in a contemporary light, we can see that this relationship of an older and more powerful man grooming a teenage girl into a marriage that ended with her leaving her family and culture of origin behind, with very grave consequences for her life. What we have available to us in the papers Mermanjan left behind tells a different story. And again, this is a story that is affected by all of these elements, right? It's affected by this differentiation in power. It's affected by this differentiation in race and ethnicity and imperial status. Mermanjan recalls her relationship with Thomas as one of love. She claims that she says she's in love with him. She, in her later years, when she recounts her marriage to her friends, that she remains devoted to her first husband. She makes it really clear that she thinks her second marriage is a totally financial arrangement, practical arrangement, not one based in affection or emotion. Writing in her diary after Thomas's death, she refers to him as, quote, her late darling husband. And she refers to her second husband as Dr. O'Kearney, which is not, super affectionate. So Mermanjan, according to the evidence, right, then understood her first marriage to be based in love. But of course, that still doesn't mean it wasn't a deeply unequal relationship. And so what we're going to work with here is sort of holding those things in tension, right? Both the idea that this was an unequal relationship shaped by all of these imbalances, and also her experience of that relationship, which changes her life course and shapes the material she left behind. Okay, now to think in terms of race. So in the late 18th and early 19th century, relationships and marriages between British men and Native Indian women had been relatively common and seen as a normal part of British presence in India. They remained relatively common, but they were just something you couldn't talk about, and they were something that you couldn't make known publicly, and they were something that people more commonly restricted to non-elites than elite members of British society, in part because there started to be repercussions around employment and status for elite British men who got into mixed relationships. And so this painting from the late 18th century is sort of like the most famous image of a British Indian family. This is Major William Palmer, his wife Bibi Fayez-Baksh, and their children, and some of their servants. And you can see that this painting was created in a style that was meant to be displayed as a family portrait. This was not art commissioned by a man who necessarily wanted to hide his family away. And you can also see that it is sort of enshrined in the central archive of British India, which is the British Library and the India Office collection there. This would not have been done by the 1840s. This type of relationship, again, though still happening, wouldn't have been celebrated in the same way, and it wouldn't have been recorded or depicted in the same way. And there are a lot of reasons for that. Some of them have to do with changing mores, generally speaking, across the British Indian world, so sort of like the rise of Victorian evangelical culture. Some of them have to do with changing British policies, which tried to prevent what they talked about as like a Creole population that you would see in parts of the Americas from being put in place in India. And as I mentioned, there started to be ramifications around your career and social status. And so by the 1840s and 50s, relationships like this would have been unusual for career-minded officers like Vaughan. And again, this had to do with people who were in sort of the higher ranks of the Army and Civil Service, but not the lower ones. The marriage, though, between Thomas Vaughan and Mermanjan wasn't quite analogous to that of William Palmer and his wife. First, as I mentioned, this is Afghanistan, not India. With a family close to the royal court, the marriage between the two, if done carefully, could hypothetically, potentially have worked out politically for Vaughan if he had decided to situate himself within or adjacent to the court in Kabul. There were also, the couple worked really hard to make themselves respectable. So they both worked to refer to Mermanjan as a princess and to sort of claim this kind of royal status, which would allow them to sort of supersede the concerns about nation and race that would have affected people who were engaged in more sort of middle class marriages. And finally, they used the sort of classic description of Mermanjan saying that she was of Circassian origin, which was something that people tended to do if they were trying to paper over questions of race and ethnicity in this region. The Circassians, reputedly blonde, blue-eyed, fair-skinned, really sort of destabilized ideas about race for Victorians in a way that Thomas and Mermanjan would have found useful. In spite of all of this, the couple married in secret, and then they married in a Muslim ceremony, which potentially could have given them a certain amount of leeway as a couple. They could have potentially separated without the formality of a divorce. But Thomas seemed eager to maintain a real marriage with Mermanjan, and when his regiment was assigned to move on from Kabul, he asked her to come with him. She was worried that her family wouldn't let her leave, that her male relatives would track down Mon, and that the relationship might spark off new hostilities between the British and Afghan soldiers. So she remained behind. But after a few months, Mermanjan decided that it would be worth risking her family's anger and that her absence would by then not be linked to the departure of the British, and followed him into India. The account her later biographers wrote is like something out of a romance novel. She sneaks off into the night with only some desire and a slave to accompany her. She sells valuables along the road to fund her journey, and she finally makes it to Thomas's house, where she collapses on his doorstep when he was in the middle of a dinner party. So it's very dramatic. Reunited, the couple then had to figure out not how to live dramatically, but how to navigate life living in a British Indian community as just like a normal couple. And it's in this period that Mermanjan starts writing in her sketchbook and diaries. Here's one of Maud's images of her on horseback, very like gorgeous, parading through the countryside. This is a bit more realism. And so you can see in these types of images, someone working through trying to write in English, trying to learn the language, and not just learn the language, but to learn enough of the language and learn enough of the skills to be a Victorian housewife, basically, which would have been difficult for anyone coming to this position from the outside, but was made even more so by someone who was learning absolutely everything from scratch. So they lived this way for nearly a decade. Thomas was urging Mermanjan to marry him in the Church of England, but she was hesitant to do so, and she didn't want to convert to Christianity. He finally convinced her, and they married in the Bombay Cathedral in 1858. So this is heart of empire. This is very respectful. This is a sort of acceptance of this relationship. And this was likely prompted by a number of events, right? So this marriage was happening in 1858, which means that it comes at the end of the Indian Rebellion, which had made, among other things, mixed marriages even more fraught than they had previously been. Thomas's own military career was faltering. The end of the rebellion meant for the British reorganizing their army and governance system in India. And so it meant that many people who had worked within the military and civil service were getting their jobs redistributed. And it also meant that it would be easier for them to travel to England together. The marriage was officially registered with Mermanjan's name anglicized as Mirman and then Jane. And almost immediately after the marriage, the couple traveled to England. They spent 1858 and early 1859 in Kent, where Mermanjan lived as a respectable Victorian wife. She took on the role of housekeeper, she kept a list of the household accounts, and the practical part of the domestic sphere seemed to have been her own. She maintained detailed records of expenses that she and Maud incurred while in England, and these include extensive lists of household expenditures. She also, there we go. expenditures. She also kept really careful notes of what she and her maid Kate ate every day. And the food that they ate was very decidedly English, with only occasional sort of hints of Asian influences. The only thing really is curry, and by this point, curry was in like Mrs. Beaton's cookbook. It was one of sort of the classic dishes that you would eat in a Victorian house. She would later take charge of her household finances totally, ably managing the purchases, sales, and negotiations necessary to running a 19th century home. And so you see later on when they are either leaving England, returning to India, or moving house in India, she writes that she sold a lot of different things to raise money. So these lists give us a good idea of the responsible role she played in her own household. But the correspondence gives us a glimpse into her own mental state, as do the drawing. So while she was in England, she met with friends and neighbors and relations and kept up correspondence with them back in India. The bulk of that surviving correspondence comes from later on when she returned to India. And much of what she writes at this point is fairly distinguishable from that which would have been written by an educated Anglo-Indian lady. So visitors were coming. She had to get the house ready for them. She had a new horse that reminded her of one she'd ridden in her childhood. The hills in Shimla were beautiful and reminded her of paintings she'd seen in the Bond Street Gallery in London. So in other words, she had learned how to perfectly inhabit the role of a Victorian wife and Indian correspondent, down to comparing the local scenery to images that were safely contained in a London shop, instead of comparing them to the mountains she would have known as a child in Afghanistan. But that would have meant nothing to her English correspondent. And she also was conversant enough with English sort of social mores that she knew how to name drop. This was a blockbuster exhibition that she'd gone to see in London. And so she sort of mentioned that she'd gone to it as well. In spite of this, though, she gives occasional glimpses of feeling out of place. So in 1860, back in India, she wrote to Thomas's niece from Pune. She'd gone to a dance with Thomas and described her jewels, writing, "In my hair, I had a diamond star in the middle and front of the plate, and a string of gold coins from it on each side to the back of my neck, so you could see my dark complexion. I must have looked something like a Spanish gypsy woman. But your uncle said it was, quote, all right, which was quite enough to make me feel comfortable during the evening, which, to say true, I enjoyed very much." Arraying herself in jewels that made her feel as if she were drawing attention from her race still made Mermanjan uncomfortable. She wanted Thomas's approval to ensure that she was moving through the social world smoothly and correctly, and that she'd found a version of herself that she could present in this space that would work. This party would have been among the last Mermanjan and Thomas attended together. He had picked up a nagging cough in England, which at first amused Mermanjan. She wrote, "Little did I think he would be the longest to suffer from English colds." In addition to his poor health, Thomas was worried that he wouldn't be able to attain a new position in the reorganized India. In a weakening condition, Thomas Mann took an incorrectly mixed dose of medicine and died in July of 1861. Mermanjan was devastated. In her later account to Beatrice Dimmock, she said that she was so distraught that she could not look after herself and stayed with a friend whose name is recorded only as Mrs. Sandwith. Mrs. Sandwith encouraged Mermanjan to seek out a second husband. Speedy remarriage would have been relatively common among military wives in India, especially those with no family to help them. Mermanjan, though, didn't seem to need the financial support a marriage would bring. She had enough money left to support herself well into her 60s, but she must have felt out of place in a new city with no contact with her own family and Mann's relations an ocean away. Though Mermanjan would keep in contact with Mann's family after his death, she must have felt hesitant about leaving what had become her home for a new country once again. The idea of going back to England didn't seem to have crossed her mind, especially without the cloaking of respectability a husband would lend her. So in 1863, in part as the result of Mrs. Sandwith's suggestion, she married Francis O'Kearney, a surgeon in the Bombay Medical Service. Mermanjan and Francis, who she called Frank, led an active social life. One of Mermanjan's diaries from the late 1860s and early 1870s lists many visits around the cantonment in Pune, including list their lengthy stay in Dublin, and eventually setting in Mahabaleshwar. Mermanjan kept track of the births, marriages, and deaths in the regiment in which troops came and went. So by this point, her diaries are just like a list of gossip about everyone that she knows. She noted when she and Frances went hunting together and how many birds they brought down. She recorded the romantic trials of their butler, and she seems to have created a robust social network for herself, extending to friends at her various stations around India. She even recorded, again, a meeting with one of Thomas's relatives in 1864 to visit his grave. So she did have these connections available to her over time. The O'Kearney's marriage, though, was long and unhappy. In 1875, Mermanjan was considering signing a deed of separation against Frances, which would have been an incredibly bold, life-altering move. And she was planning on doing this because he had been spending her money extravagantly. So that gives us another sort of clue into the nature of this relationship, that potentially their marriage happened because she required his status and he required some of her financial security. By the 1890s, though, their relationship had fallen apart to such a degree that Frances brought a divorce case on charges of infidelity. At this point, Mermanjan was in her early 60s and was going blind. Though she could not see, her husband did not provide her with a servant to help her dress, which again would have been incredibly not only cruel in terms of not caring for a woman who needed help, but unusual in terms of not providing a servant in that type of household. He wouldn't allow her to eat at the dining table with him, but instead had her food brought to her room. So he essentially had shut her away. She was allowed to go out driving, but reported that her husband and his sister-in-law, who had come to live with, and her sister-in-law, who had come to live with the couple, followed her wherever she went. So she was very much confined. This situation came to a crisis point in December of 1894, when O'Kearney brought this charge of infidelity against her in the High Court of Bombay in hopes of obtaining a divorce. He claimed that Mermanjan had been sleeping with the local blacksmith. This would be highly unlikely given that he was in his 30s and their main relationship appeared to be he read the Quran to her. But he brought this evidence forth nonetheless. Mermanjan was mortified to think that her friends might believe these rumors. She frequently visited the library at the Mahabaleshwar Club to escape the increasingly oppressive atmosphere at her home. And there she formed another relationship that became essential in her story with the club librarian, a man named D.B. Klokar, who served as a go-between, conveying news of Mermanjan's domestic situation to her other friends, including Beatrice Dimmock. So by this point, she's living in a social world where her husband is accusing her of infidelity. She has a very confined sort of social world, particularly in her household. But even given that, she's able to go out into the community and create these other relationships, which become forms of support. So according to the librarian, one of the reasons O'Kearney's accusations made Mermanjan so distraught was that having her case tried in the Bombay High Court was, quote, very disgraceful. She felt that she had been put to the level of the commonest black man. And so Mermanjan had worked through both of her marriages to align herself with the Anglo communities in which she lived. Her close relationship with Beatrice Dimmock and with various other women in the Anglo community would also suggest that she was aligning herself with this group. She really had little other choice. She was very far from home. She had cut ties to her family and culture of origin, but being brought to court in a public manner threatened to unravel the sort of carefully constructed status that she had maintained as an Afghan princess rather than a discarded native wife. And she relied on that status over the years in order to support her social position in the various British communities in which she lived. The case in the end did not go to trial, but settled out of court. O'Kearney returned to Ireland for a time. He eventually came back to India at Mermanjan's request. The couple reunited in the early years of the 20th century, both very, very long-lived, and seem to, as far as the archive will show, have lived peacefully at that point, although potentially they were too tired to fight any longer. O'Kearney died in 1911 and Mermanjan in 1917. She left no living children, and so she gave her papers to her friend Beatrice, who would become one of her first chroniclers. Okay, now that we know the outlines of her story, I want to spend the rest of my time looking at how and why it's been told and retold, and I want to start by looking at some of these images. So these images were created by Mermanjan and Thomas Mann. And these 2 pages give you a really kind of good view of the sort of collaborative process. So the way that this stuff is cataloged in the British Library, it gives you a real good sense of who is writing or drawing what at what point, just that there are very clearly 2 hands involved. So Mermanjan tended to draw people facing front or back to the paper. You can see here, she also tended not to draw hands because she wasn't very good at drawing hands. Highly relatable. Maud tended to draw people in profile, and some of these sort of little profile styles, these are less so, but other pages you can see it better. All this devolved into type, like a caricature type of expression of a face. And you can see all of this stuff appears in these notebooks sort of cobbled together. So you get notes about sort of communications from government offices, receipts of money, etc., on the same page as drawings and doodles. Okay, so I do want to think about, with a little audience participation, what you think about these images. So I've looked at these, I've played with them for a while. I think they're so striking. And when you look at them in the archive, you can sort of see how thick these books are, right? Page after page after page after page of this type of image of people ranked together in this manner. And so you tend to have them predominantly huge groups of men or huge groups of women. Occasionally, you'll have a mixed set of people. So what do we think? What are your impressions of these? What's going on?
They do have individual facial features in that. It's like they are different people, not the same person over and over again.
Yeah. I mean, I think it is like fascinating, right? Because when you first look at them, especially when you see them in bulk, it's like these are just one person recurring, but they're not. They have different facial features. Some of them have different facial hair. Some of them have sort of differentiations in their outfits. So like these guys have certain types of coats on and top hats and whatever. This potentially could even be seen as a certain recurrence of Thomas's. You have my dear written at the bottom of the image. And they sort of explode off the page, right? Like there's no sense that there's boundaries to where these figures are. Go this way. And then in the case of the female figures, you see a similar thing. And they were sort of like looking outright and like confronting the viewer in a way. They can be seen as threatening. They can be seen as welcoming. I mean, yeah.
I mean, the drawings seem, it's like pretty interesting because it reminds me a lot of, I mean, even something I do myself where it's like, even like at the end of the day, it's like I'll like draw, or even I like see like the English language and like letters where it's like, sometimes I'll have pages where it's like, it's scribbled like relevant information about my day alongside drawings that are somewhat relevant as well. So it's pretty interesting with like, it's either this kind of like, maybe like this like end of day ritual or like just like something, but it's really interesting. And I wonder, I mean, I will never know, but what the thought process behind the drawings were, that's my guess of what it could be, something similar to that.
Yeah, I mean, like I thought of things like this is just sort of like getting your sort of psyche out on the page, right? This is practicing. This is in certain cases, this one, you have these women sort of like in conversation with one another with a man in the front. And the man, he has like a turban, right? He's wearing, this is not like British attire. Do these remind you of anything? Because they reminded me of one thing in particular. Yeah.
So are these like some kind of why so many figures?
I know.
Is she kind of talking about social gatherings? Like she's always in a group, and are these different versions of her, but they all seem quite similar?
Yeah. So in one way, I thought, is she practicing, right? Like, is she practicing being the type of person who can move through this society? Like, are these all versions of her? All these different versions of her in different scenarios? Or are these all images of people who are potentially emulable, right? Like that you could look at them and sort of gain information from them and draw useful practices from them in order to be part of this society. Another thing, especially with these I was thinking about, is where she would encounter these types of images. Because yes, she'd be going out into society, but she would also be learning how to draw, how to write, etc. And so one of the things that I think are influencing some of these are fashion magazines. And so fashion plates. And if you look at things, fashion magazines and publications from the 19th century, you see a lot of these fashion plates with women sort of posed in relation to one another, showing off the clothes. And the point of these images is not to show women sort of chatting or out for a walk or whatever. They're to show women doing those things in a way that makes the clothes most visible so that you could take those images and replicate them in your own wardrobe. And so those fashion magazines seem like they are a likely influence on what she's doing here. And they're also a likely influence on her trying to figure out how to fit into this new type of culture and this new type of society. One of the sort of things that comes up in Dimmock's description of her is that she received from Thomas a doll. And when I first saw that, I was like, oh my God, this is just a deeply distressing relationship, which it is, like a deeply distressing relationship with like childlike figure. And this is the case. I also think there's a very high possibility that this was a fashion doll, the kind that would be designed to wear this type of outfit and accompany a fashion magazine to give you a sense of what the clothes looked like, how they fit together, the details that wouldn't be available if you just had a piece of paper in front of you. And I'm speculating on this because the kind of childlike relationship that gets discussed in the Dimmock books and accounts seems to have very little to do with who she was in her own account and how she related to people. Okay, so as I was trying to sort through these, one of the things that I kept thinking of was how do you make sense of images that are put together by multiple people, but you don't know precisely who those people are or what their intent was. And this is where I came to this idea of scrapbooking and thinking about scrapbooking as a useful way of sorting through this archive. So as I mentioned earlier, scrapbooks were one of the things that she left in her archives. The British Library's very uneven reproduction policy does not allow me to show you those scrapbooks, but they include things like a pencil sketch of an explosion at a munitions factory, a drawing of a very big fluffy white cat, photographs of illustrations of Queen Victoria and Prince Albert. Some of them are in color, some of them are engravings, and they range from before and after Thomas Mott's death. So it's possible that she worked on this scrapbook with him. It's possible that she worked on it with Francis Kearney. But whoever the contributors were, the combination of items inside suggests a real engagement with British print culture and only a touristic kind of influence or interest in the people and scenery of India. It features very little, almost with the exception of the explosion in the munitions factory, it features almost no images of India or Indian scenes. And so seeing this scrapbook in conjunction with the rest of the archive kind of made me start to think about how the archive itself was put together. The scrapbooks have become a popular way across class and gender in the 19th century of saving mementos and creating community. Some friend groups use them as autograph books, passing them around from person to person to sign and include their own messages in writing. In travel writing, visual culture, and form, Claire Pettit writes that the items selected and displayed in a scrapbook become symbolically powerful, partly as a result of the physical practice of putting them there. And so this is a seemingly really simple insight, right? Like it matters that people put their stuff in a scrapbook. But I think it's a really important insight because what we see a lot in the archive is how very random it can be, particularly in light of how unlikely it is for a lot of this stuff to have even ended up in a formal archive in the first place. And so the idea that the items that exist and have stayed from Mermanjan's life were selected, I think is really powerful. Many of the letters were in her own writing, which means she would have had to collect them from the people she sent them to. They would have had to be sent back to her in some way. The sketches and clippings and lists and notebooks that this material comes from were important for enough for her to preserve in India, to transport with her from India to England and then back again, and to find a home for them with a friend when she had no children to pass them on to. In Writing with Scissors, Ellen Garvey's study of the American tradition of scrapbooking in the same period, she notes that 19th century scrapbooks, like the one in Mermanjan's papers, were created piecemeal from all kinds of ephemeral sources. Multiple hands would contribute to these books, and authorship was seldom credited. When authorship was noted, what mattered was not who was responsible for the individual contributions, but that it was a communal product. Garvey argues that creating in this communal manner created community outside dominant social modes. Quote, as a group gathers to pull apart mainstream culture and remake it for their own uses, they create their own cultural nexus, a knot of threads leading into and out of the family or community, and they make themselves more culturally central. Mermanjan and Thomas did this kind of pulling apart and remaking, patching together objects to make sense of their marriage that was seen by others as at best an exotic romance and at worst a serious misjudgment on his part, and one that adversely affected his career. Garvey considered scrapbooks to be a means of creating a vernacular, decentralized archive in which people who did not have access to official forms of power or preservation can create and interpret their own histories. So seen in this light, the items in Mermanjan's collection sent her her own interpretation of her history, one that she willingly co-created with her beloved first husband, one that preserves both his history and her own, and one that supports her side of the conflict with her second husband. The form of Mermanjan's collection echoes that of the scrapbook. It came into being out of a series of relationships between Mermanjan and Thomas, Mermanjan and Beatrice Dimmock, and Beatrice and her descendants. Engaging with these histories of scrapbooking helps us to better understand the material fragments that Mermanjan left behind, and also to understand how the archive gets created. So this is the decentralized archive. How does it end up in the centralized archive, which is to say, the Asian Pacific reading room of the British Library? So Mermanjan's friendships, as we've seen, were a significant part of this story. In her later years, she relied on this network of friends I talked about, from Beatrice to Kulakar and others in the hill station in which she lived, to protect her reputation and to help her maintain her social standing when it was threatened. Mermanjan gave Beatrice her papers, which leads to the preservation in the British Library. And the after effects of these relationships have shaped not only how we are able to access this material, but the histories of Mermanjan, Thomas, and Frances O'Kearney, and the Dimmocks themselves. So since Mermanjan's death, the Dimmock family has added their own layers of interpretation to her story. Beatrice Dimmock included Mermanjan's story in her manuscript memoir of her time in India. And the Mermanjan portion of that document is like way bigger than the portion about Beatrice's own life. She talks a little bit about her own experiences as the daughter of a family of Indian civil servants, as the wife of a surgeon in the Indian medical service, but mostly she talks about Mermanjan and her history. And her daughter Gertrude, who then takes this material and writes her own book about it, starts her account of Mermanjan's life in the following way. As a child, I loved to hear from my mother the story of her old blind friend, Mrs. O'Kearney, who had married first an Englishman, then an Irishman, and who was really an Afghan princess. It seemed as if she were under some kind of enchantment. And so this is like very fanciful, and it actually is a terrible framing device for the book for the obvious reason, but also because like the book is actually quite well done, it's well written, and it's decently researched. She spent a lot of time on it, and it sounds in fact quite ridiculous based on the framing device. At the conclusion of Star of the Evening, Gertrude offers her own description of how the family ended up with Mermanjan's papers. So she says that Mermanjan, quote, left her treasured relics to Beatrice. Eventually, the tin trunk containing the little Afghan clothes, and again, this sort of like little, the sort of diminutive, like child infantilizing kind of discussion of Mermanjan you can see throughout. Little Afghan clothes in which she had run away to join Thomas, the papers, letters, account books, sketches, and pieces of music found their way to England. Beatrice kept them and handed them in due course to her younger daughter, Gertrude, to whom, after a lapse of years, has fallen the task of sorting and piecing together the story of love and hate, joy and sorrow, faith, courage, and endurance. So again, very savvy. Within this statement, Gertrude kind of glosses over the amount of work that would have gone into transporting and preserving these materials. But think about it for a moment, right? So Mermanjan was doing this, and then this other family does it themselves. The trunk doesn't find its way to England. Beatrice brought it. She would have had to pack Mermanjan's things. She would have moved them from one Indian location to another, guard them against damage from climate and insects, and ship them alongside a household worth of goods when the Dimmock family eventually returned to England. She then purposefully passed them to Gertrude, actively handed them, as Gertrude puts it, rather than passively left. And so I think the amount of attention that's paid to these items in the Dimmock family is really telling. Because on the one hand, this is a story of a friendship. On the other hand, is the story of people who really found someone who were a little more interested in who they were and wanted to include her in their own family's history. So they sort of folded Mermanjan's life into their own story, sort of pulling it apart, rewriting it in much the same way that Mermanjan and Thomas sketched out and recombined their own relationship. And so this borrowing and retelling and repurposing can seem like the ultimate act of cultural appropriation, taking on the story of another to make your own family's history more exciting. And it is that. But it is also something that has entangled the Dimmock family history with Mermanjan's story. And so we can see it in the sketches done in collaboration with Thomas. We can see it in the fragmentary household account, the scattered letters, and the sort of narrative accretions of the Dimmock family onto this tale. But we can also see it in the archive itself. And so please excuse the screenshot. This is from the Old British Library catalog, listing papers of and relating to Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Mon, Bombay Army, his Afghan wife Mermanjan, and her second husband, Francis O'Kearney, Bombay Medical Service, within E304. Immediate source of acquisition presented by Mrs. D.B.G. Line, that's Gertrude Line, 14th November, 1969. And so E304 is not just Mermanjan's materials, it's also the Dimmock family materials. All of their letters, Beatrice's account, their diaries, they're in this file. And so you get this kind of very bizarre enfolding of multiple families who are in a lot of ways unrelated. And so the papers of Thomas Mon, his Afghan wife Mermanjan, and her second husband become part of the Dimmick family, but they also supersede the Dimmick family in terms of the way they get preserved within the archive itself. And actually, the British Library just redid its catalog a couple months ago, and I want to go on and see if this has been changed at all. I don't think it did because they seem like they have a lot going on. And this is the kind of enfolding that frequently happens to the history of women, that they are subsumed under their husband's names. But in this case, this is a English family that has been subsumed again under a husband, but also under Mermanjan's own history. And so then to wrap up a little bit, I want to think about, sorry, going quite long. I want to think about what we can take from this. And what we can take from this idea of seeing scrapbooking as a way of thinking through the archive. Mermanjan's history, the Dimmick family history, the Kearney family history, the Mon family history all get mixed up together. And this interweaving becomes both accidental and purposeful. Like, these are people who have collaborated together, and these are things that have ended up in the archive. These are items that have been purposely passed along, and these are things that have been saved, we don't know for what reason. What is left is a joint archive that replicates the logics of imperialism, and that leaves neither colonizer nor colonized unaltered by the experience. Using the metaphor and practice of scrapbooking to interpret Mermanjan's life and papers doesn't just create another method for demonstrating multiple ways in which empire and imperial subjects are intertwined, but it also allows us to trace the ways in intimate relationships and friendships, which we see recorded here, in all their complexity, shape individual lives and how they're remembered. And when I talk about friendship, I don't just mean like the warm, fuzzy version of friendship. I mean friendship in all its complexity, social relationships, toxic relationships, every way that we understand friendship. And the formal archive does a really bad job of recording this. It does a bad job of recording those types of relationships. The formal archive is shaped around the state, the family, the individual, and it remains really resistant to revealing these unofficial relationships. But shifting our perspective outside of those categories, outside of the categories that are really limited and show up on screens like this, allows us to see how the formal archive can contain the remnants of many different informal archives, like that of Mermanjan, that have been chosen, pieced together, and handed down to make meaning. Thank you. I'd love to hear comments. I'd love to hear more things you think about the drawings. Yeah.
Just out of curiosity, how big a bundle did all these things make?
So there are like 3 notebooks, and they're like moleskin sized. So like about this, kind of like that. There's like 3 bundles of letter collection. There is a transcript, a typed transcript of the Dimmick account, and then there is a like manuscript draft of the Gertrude Lyne's book. So, and also everything that's mentioned as being contained in the trunk is not in the archive. So the material objects like dresses, etc., are not there.
So it's like one big.
Like a big box, yeah. Like I would imagine it's like one archival box, yeah. Yeah.
First, just thank you for the talk. It's really fascinating stuff, and I'm still kind of mulling over a lot of it, right? Like, so I will try not to ask you too many questions, but thank you. I think I just want to ask you 2 things,
Yeah.
if possible. One, and a lot of this has to go to, I think, in the history of attempting to reconstruct a personality through like what you're pointing out over here. I think it's like really on point, right? This is a performance.
Yeah.
And she's very actively curating the sense of who she is and with an audience in mind, right? And I think here, I'm just curious about your thoughts on your task while interpreting all these things and the slippage between how she sees herself or wishes to be perceived for this audience, and then the history that she's kind of operating in. And I think like
Yeah.
the first point that really caught me is fairly proverbial, the amount of sexual violence
Yeah.
the British Army wreaked on Afghanistan during this war, right? Like not just during the years of occupation, but then the Army of Vengeance. Like even the revolt in Kabul is kind of still proverbially spoken of as an episode of British rape, right? And this is why the war had to be waged. And in particular, this kind of episode of, okay, she's sitting in Kabul, she leaves it and kind of goes and chases what is effectively still a colonial occupying soldier. In this context, one way or the other, whether or not one is reading the thing straight, or if one is kind of thinking about her as somebody who, I would find it strange if she was not also aware of all of this, and then like given where she is living, I wonder how that context like puts a pressure on these narratives and performances that you've kind of brought up. That's one thing. I think the second thing is kind of related in that this exact period that you're talking about, between the 40s and the 80s and the 19th century, like Afghan is not a stable reference. Especially for the British. Like they're constantly reevaluating what Afghan means to them. And the same thing is happening in Afghanistan. Because Afghanistan is a very recent kind of even terminology. Duranis in the 18th century, the kings say we are the kings of Khorasan. Like they do not say we are the kings of Afghanistan. Afghanistan does not look with the borders that it has right now. So I'm curious where the heuristic is kind of coming in your work as to the distinction between her being an Afghan lady in India, like versus these native Indians, and kind of using these these kind of categories. Is that something she is performing? Is that something that the this Dinmok, is that the other family? Yeah, is that something they are kind of writing about as well, or is that something in general that her husbands are also commenting about? I'm just curious where that comes from, because it would seem like we're literally in the point as these things are transitioning from Afghans are not a nation to Afghans are the chief martial race of the people that helped put down all the damn dirty natives during 1857, right? So I'm just wondering where the heuristic is coming.
So that they all use this Afghan princess thing.
There are ones that are saying princess, right? There are multiple.
There are multiple examples also from basically the same period of other people doing this thing.
A lot of mysterious Afghan princesses after 1858 in India.
So it's obviously super useful. And I think it's something that they are using because they know it works.
Right.
And it's something that they are using to people who have a very kind of hazy idea of what it means.
Right, but also in that first context of the immense amount of rape and pillage that the British do. And I think even like saying that like Afghan princess is protective, right? Like this is not some girl that he found. This is a member of a royal court. That's the image that they're portraying, right? Right.
Yeah, and so like being like, no, this is someone who should move within our society because she has this very sort of specific identity that we have sort of curated for her that makes her just on the one side of respectability. And I think that the sort of shifting nature of Britain's relationship to Afghanistan matters, but because the sort of like Afghan princess idea is so clearly fanciful, but potentially real at the same time, that it becomes just like a really powerful way of saying like, we're not taking other questions. We're not taking other questions about how this relationship started. We're not taking other questions about her background. This is a respectable relationship. And then in terms of sort of like your first question about sexual violence, this is something that there is a version of this story where this is it is entirely constructed. It's entirely constructed in order to cover that up. It's entirely constructed in order to make her a respectable person, again, within British Indian society, and sidestep all of those questions of sexual violence or histories of sexual violence. She works so hard to create this image. And this, again, is why later in life, when it's threatened, she uses like quite racist language to shut it down, because she's like, if this idea of myself stops being available to me, then I stop existing as a person, really, within the society. Other questions? Yeah.
This is just a question about, so you're talking about scrapbooking as this way to look at these materials, and scrapbooks and booking being more like an informal archive versus like the official formal archive, but then you're finding like the connection between the formal and informal, and finding this in the British Library. I'm just kind of interested in like how you even go about finding this, or like if you want to look into scrapbooking, because like I'm looking at this finding aid and wondering like, do you do like, I don't know, keyword searches for
Yeah,
or, like,
so I came like, so the scrapbooking sort of methodology came way later.
okay.
This came out of, I think I got here with, I don't know, there's probably something about like somewhere in here, maybe not this page, but a different page, there's something about social life. And that's how I got here. And then I started reading this stuff and it was like, this is a whole other, like, this is a whole other story. So some of them will say something like scrapbooking, or scrapbook. There's lots of people are starting to do sort of like digital collections of scrapbooks because they're really cool to look through, and they're also miserable for archives to maintain, because if you've looked at even a photo album from like 40 years ago, all that stuff is falling out, and like, you know, people have messed around with it and whatever. And so digitizing them is like this huge boon to archives, because people are able to look at the stuff in them without accidentally dropping a Valentine on the ground while they're flipping through the pages. And so that's, I think, one of the other ways of going about it. But yeah, most like this, the scrapbookiness of this was pure happenstance as I was looking for stuff, just basically on, like, I think I actually got here because like she does all these lists of what she ate. And so the rest of it just happened. And so like part of that kind of, and that was like the tension that I find really interesting, right? Which is like, you can have like really good archival research practice, but also you just find random stuff, right? And like, how do you kind of sort through those elements of research? And how do you sort through those elements of what the archive looks like? Because, right, so much stuff has been put there with a very specific idea of creating a very specific narrative. And of course, this collection also has been edited in some ways that we don't know about. But at the same time, it's meaningful that it's there, right? Yeah.
I was curious if you've come across or remember coming across her ever talking about reading some literature. I mean, because there's also like literature about construction and you think back time, and so I'm wondering if she ever mentioned.
Yeah, she totally does not. Yeah, the reason that I find the images so fascinating is like the aesthetics of them. Also because her diaries, like so many diaries from this period and also now, are kind of boring. Like they're like, this happened today. These are the people I saw. This is the stuff I ate. I sold a horse. I bought a new horse. Like I went for a carriage ride. And you can create all kinds of sort of like social worlds out of that stuff. But like getting a sense of who a person is out of that is very difficult. But the images tend, in part because they sort of defy really sort of easy explanations of what they are, suggest a bit more interiority. The letters have, like as I sort of mentioned, the letters have sort of more of a sense, just in the way that you would write to someone, and hopefully include more interesting information than just a list of stuff you were doing. They have more of a sense of her sort of interior life as a person. But I call them diaries, but really they're closer to day books, where it's just like what I did.
Thank you.
But I think also at the same time, right, and then like you were mentioning, the idea that like you can go and interpret these images is very seductive, but also, you know, I have a limited amount of information to work with, and ultimately it's a human life.
Thank you.
I have two questions. I'm interested, I mean, I work a lot on the Black Sea. So you
Mhm.
mentioned that she's described in one place as being
Mhm.
Circassian, and
Yeah.
that got my attention.
Yeah.
That, I mean, Circassianness in this time period on the 19th century, on the
Yeah.
one hand implies whiteness, but
Yeah.
it also implies sexual slavery, and
Yeah.
there's all the stuff about,
It was her mother.
well, yeah, so that's why I wanted to
Yeah.
know more about
Yeah.
how does this come in? How does the Circassianness work with the Afghanness in terms of strategies? And anyway, so I'm curious about
Yeah,
that.
so yeah.
Yeah. The other question, when you mentioned the list of stuff in the trunk, there was also music, and I was wondering
Yeah.
if music was actually.
There's in the scrapbook, there's some like sheet music and like sort of inserted in.
Okay.
But other than there isn't, I didn't find any sort of like sheets of music or anything like that. Nothing was handwritten. These are like purchased. And then in terms of, yeah, I think it's like a way of talking, and much in the way like the Afghan princess thing, it's like a way of talking about identity, which is slippery enough that you're able to pass through a variety of different social contexts. And I think they make this really kind of like note of being her mother, like of descent. And so yes, there's maybe this like history of sexual impropriety behind it, but that's not what she is. Like she's potentially a result of that, or many generations along a result of it, but is not herself involved. And in part, I think even like her youth at the time of marriage becomes in a way kind of an argument for that.
This is like this rhymes with the story of Samuel Baker,
Mhm.
and Lady Baker,
Mhm.
who he is traveling in
Mhm. Yeah.
the Ottoman Empire on the Romania or something, and goes to a slave market because that's what you do when you're a wealthy British aristocrat visiting the Ottoman Empire. Sees a young woman there, a slave, and then like the way that family tells the story is he breaks her out and she goes and travels around with him a lot. And then they finally get married a long time down the line. And then Queen Victoria would accept her because they clearly traveled together and sin. Sorry, I just it was just like I'm really Samuel Baker's kind of this like, but the what was my question about this? Is this like I guess I wanted to raise that as a comparison because it's a much more famous story.
Yeah.
And it has some of these same elements of kind of a romantic story with a very troubling gender power dynamic once you scrape away the very thin family embellishment. And then the kind of long afterlife after Samuel Baker dies, where she is navigating society. I guess the question I had about that was keeps going to my mind and slipping. Was so what is the, I guess, and this goes back to Tanvia's question as well. If we're thinking about gender and power in the British Empire as a whole, what does kind of the recurrence of stories like this and performances like this tell us about specifically kind of gender, like marriage and youth and sexual violence and family in the British? Is there something that we can generalize more out of that about the British Empire?
Yeah.
Especially from this kind of source.
Yeah. I mean, I think if you think about these, if you think about these as like the success stories, like they're not the success stories, but they're stories that are people who were successful enough that they have been preserved in the archives or have like been in some sort in an elevated enough social position that these histories have a history. They have been recorded. And I think part of it is just sort of like this is stuff that happens all of the time, and those stories don't get recorded. And that the sort of overlay of the fairy tale retelling, the romanticized retelling, the like princessiness of it all is there because it's hiding, much like in a real estate deal, some really distressing stuff. And that stuff is sort of intrinsic to the whole British imperial, everyone's imperial project. And that it's just part of what happens in empire, but this is a way that it's both kind of brought to the surface a bit more, but also hidden a bit more successfully because it can be covered over under these like narrative forms that people are really accustomed to and have a lot of time for. Like they have a lot of time for an exotic romance. They have a lot of time for a fairy tale. They don't have a lot of time for like someone being ripped away from their family. They don't have a lot of time for sexual violence. So it's like a way of seeing that stuff that's so inherent to the British Empire, but at the same time seeing how effectively it can be covered over.
So first a comment, it's fascinating, very thought-provoking. I'm also thinking about a lot of things, thought about this particular perspective, how scrapbooking can make us think about all these things. One question I have, you're talking about performance, and you mentioned that she's practicing.
Yeah.
Right. So this is all representation. If we talk about representation, did you see any difference between and first, do you think she sees herself, she's practicing this imperial subjecthood? And is there a difference in the way she's practicing that or performing that when she's in Britain versus when she's in India? Do you see any difference? And is there any significance to that?
So one of the things you see in Britain, and again, right, like so much of this is contingent, like this may have existed in India, but she threw them out. But like what remains in Britain, she is like very carefully, almost like anthropologically writing down what she does. Like in terms of the meals and everything, like she's writing that down very carefully. She's writing down her activities very carefully. And this is the part where I was like, oh, that's kind of boring. But it's like, it's also not boring, right? Because it's like, she is being so thoughtful about noting all of this stuff. And she doesn't do that in India, potentially because like this obviously is not where she's from, but she's lived there for a longer period of time and she's been in this sort of household for a longer period of time and maybe had a certain like greater degree of comfort in figuring out how to manage all of that. And so the practice in that sense is much more visible in Britain than in India. But at the same time, the practice that you do see in India is much earlier. So it's like literally like this I find so striking because did you have in elementary school that paper where like the top third was blank and then you had the bottom third and lines and you learned how to write your letters properly? This looks exactly like that. And it's potentially, this is potentially like she had like schoolroom materials and she was replicating them here. And so like this, so that is maybe makes me think, right, that like these images of recurring people, that's what makes them seem more like practice to me, right? That they're being done in this kind of rote learning setting, that she's attempting to replicate these images over and over and over again. So it's potentially that the practice that we see in England is just in different format because she's gained more competency with the language. Yeah.
I don't want to take it from anyone else.
You're good.
And just on that point, I wonder whether there's a way of reading some of this, like exactly what you're adjusting to right now, is a sort of like emergent theory of whiteness for her. Like in that, I mean, even plugging in all these different things, right? Like the citation point, right?
Wrong.
Is, I mean, this is exactly the period in which the British are becoming invested in the question of, okay, when they first meet Afghans, they meet Afghans who tell them, who are you? They ask, who are you? The Afghans say, like, we are descended from Suleiman, from Solomon, right? So there's a Semitic theory.
Yeah.
So it is the 40s to the 80s, exactly when the ethnographic projects under the company and then under the Raj go in and try to figure out, are they Avestans actually? And the conclusion is, it's an Aryan race, it's an Avestan language, like we go through all these kind of ancient Zoroastrian things in order to establish exactly these linkages. So I'm wondering whether there's a sort of proto-history through the claims of like Circassian descent,
Yeah.
through these sorts of abilities to perform in dress, in food, in letters,
Yeah.
like that, like create a sort of cobbled together theory of this is what being white is,
Yeah.
and that she can kind of freely access precisely because these other categories that may make sense to the British, because in the British mind, like maybe Afghan means a thing, but like on the ground in the context, like it was a curse word 40 years before this, right? Like, so there's I just wonder whether even that would kind of bridge together the narrative stuff where you're seeing the Afghan princess thing, but then the Circassian thing, and then the habit. Right?
Yeah, that's really fascinating. So, like, look at her earrings.
Right.
These are, this is not someone, this is someone who's like leaning into an image,
Sure.
like an Afghan image, right? Here, even though she has the like genuinely hideous, I'm gonna say 1860s looking dress on. And so this is like someone who's like piecing all of these things together. But I think that's like super fascinating to think of this kind of practice and creation of an identity recurring and being something that was part of the world that she grew up in and then proceeded after the fact, after this period.
One thing that might be interesting to read, Will Sherman has this piece out on a study of, I think it's Thomas Hughes' father up in Peshawar, who is part of the kind of mission society. It's later in the 1880s side of things, but writes this book called Rohaina, A Frontier Romance. And spoiler alert, but like it's sort of, dashing British colonial officer, poor Afghan woman, and then, secret love, all these things like honor, murder, all the stereotypes and racist crap that you can imagine that the British would say about Afghans. But in the end, the twist is he is in love with her and kind of tortured because she is like a dirty Muslim, but she is actually a kidnapped English lady that had been Afghans kidnapped her, and then like she's actually like it's okay, we can kind of bring her back and then like rechristen her, and all these things happen. But I'm wondering whether this is a kind of fascinating prehistory to exactly this epistemic anxiety that the British seem to like. Yeah, I mean, it's everywhere, but there is a specific nexus of it that gets deployed on the Northwest in the British Raj, and this is kind of, it strikes me as a pretty integral part of that other history that's like coming out later, right?
Yeah. One of the things about the way they talk about it, it's never that he saved her, which is fascinating. In none of their accounts, it's never that he saved her.
Had to be a genuine love.
It's like they're very insistent on her agency.
Were there any questions online? I don't know. I think, okay. So, thank you, Alex. That was,
Thank you.